Ladies, gentlemen, and warriors of the Empire, I am Yusril. The date is Monday, May the 5th, 2014. The game is Star Trek Online, and welcome to Holodeck Happenings. The fight against the Undine is continuing, even if the dilithium weekend will have ended by the time you watch this. With Season 9 settled in, it looks as though the most efficient way to get marks is to run the space battle zone, and there's a slight snag with that. Simply put, the engine doesn't seem able to cope with 15 plus players and the Undine, and all the puddles, rifts, torpedoes and other miscellaneous effects that fly around in a big battle. When this happens, the game will simply refuse to show certain visual and sound effects. The one I've noticed most often is that my disruptors will suddenly be silent and invisible, but the damage numbers are still showing, but shield displays are also noticeably flickering in and out of visibility. The shields are still up, they're just not rendering properly. Frame rates are also taking a beating. I run a system that's not top of the line, but pretty decent. An i7-3820 overclocked 4.4 GHz, 32 gigs of RAM and a pair of 780 titaniums, and I've noticed less than 30 FPS at my usual settings, while the forums have noted frame rate problems of greater or lesser intensity depending on the exact setup. While I've got the DxTory frame rate overlay on for this video, or at least parts of it, it should be taken with a significant pinch of salt. Remember that when recording, my system has to shift a significant extra load to get that side of things done. It's not normally 8 frames a second bad. Honest. Without recording, usually I get mid-20s at worst, enough to produce a bit of stutter, but not the end of the world. The big culprits, for me at least, seem to have been post-processing, cinematic focus, i.e. depth of field, dynamic lighting and anti-aliasing. Disabling or reducing these has helped a bit for me, although I try to keep at least some AA going since the gap in visual quality between no AA and even 2 times MSAA is very, very noticeable. Should Cryptic be criticised for this? Yes, not least because it's not a new problem. The fleet's Starbase defence mission has had a similar issue ever since it was launched. Once 20-odd players are going hammer and tongs in a single zone, the engine tends to give up and start dropping effects in an effort to cope. That the level designers are constantly trying for bigger, bolder and more epic battles is great, but when a now 4-plus-year-old engine is apparently struggling to cope with the craziest stuff, even on high-end hardware, I can't help but think that a decent chunk of resources would be well spent at looking at trying to improve this situation before Season 10 or the rumoured expansion that's coming this autumn. Moving on from that, however, with Tier 2 almost complete, it's time to take a look at some more of the shinies. Box loot for me in Tier 2 has been mostly torpedo tubes and mine layers, with the odd personal weapon and beam array mixed in. Torpedo tubes first. Always photons, always Mark 12, and always with the biomolecular mod, plus 1 or 2 random mods chosen from the usual range of accuracy, damage, crit chance and crit severity. The torpedo version of the biomolecular proc has a 100% chance to occur on hit, causes a minus 23.1 run speed snare effect, and does an extra 873.5 damage, doubling up to 1747 against Undine. That bonus damage isn't affected by bonuses on the torpedo tube. Specifically, it's not affected by the damage bonus, which you'd think it would be, but it is affected by consoles and it is affected by skills, which is why it's got a slightly odd value. If you want more mileage after this, ladies and gentlemen, up your projectile weapons skill. Actually, why haven't you upped that anyway? Mines are in a similar situation to the torpedo, but their version of the biomolecular proc is a bit more random, since it only has a 1 in 3 chance per hit of triggering, and it only does about half the damage at the end of the effect. If you cut out the maths, all 4 mines in a standard salvo hit leaves you with an 82% chance of getting at least 1 proc on the target. But these are mines we're talking about. There are builds that make good use of them, but I prefer the torpedo simply because it's not reliant on the target being A, close enough to trigger the seeker, and B, the mine being not shot down in flight, even accidentally by something like fire at will, and never mind deliberate countermeasures like tractor repulsors. As an interesting side note, I've had mines with an accuracy mod drop for me, which, being destroyable projectiles, they don't get any benefit from because mines don't roll to hit. Either I've missed a memo somewhere, or whoever programmed the random property generator forgot that little detail. Finally, we have the energy weapons. Drop rates for these have been low. I imagine that we'll see more in the Tier 3 boxes and they become purchasable for dilithium at Tier 4, but from the few I've got, damage is on a par with standard Mark 12 as you'd expect. You get one or two of the standard issue mods depending on quality level, and of course you get the biomolecular mod. This version of the mod has, on the face of it, a rather low chance of proccing, only 2.5% per hit. However, that isn't quite as bad as it initially looks. If you run the numbers, 28 hits gives you a 50% chance of at least one proc on the target. And by a curious coincidence, you get 28 shots from a 7-array broadside cycle. It's also worth bearing in mind the 2-set counter-command ordnance bonus, that is, the set involving the enhanced torpedo tube, the consoles, and the heavy biomolecular turret, because that increases the proc chance to 4.5%. Run the numbers again, and a 50% chance of at least one proc requires 16 shots, in other words, 4 arrays firing in concert. As for special issue gear, there are 2 items at Tier 2, the enhanced biomolecular photon torpedo and the counter-command deflector. I glanced at these in the last holodeck happenings, but to confirm what we already suspected from that video, it seems that torpedo tooltips are updating on the fly based on skills and consoles, and damage values on the enhanced tube are in fact exactly in line with the standard biomolecular tubes. 2 things about the enhanced torpedo do make it worth mentioning though. The standout feature is its high-yield firing mode, which does 200 to 250% of baseline damage, plus the biomolecular debuff to a single target, and every other hostile within 2.5 kilometers. While that's not high-yield tricobal damage, it's about half to 2/3 depending on your exact setup, it has the distinct advantage of not being a destroyable projectile, so it can't be intercepted, and your opponent doesn't get quite such an obvious warning of incoming pain as tricobalt torpedo flicking up on their HUD. However, it won't retarget if the initial victim is destroyed in flight, so if your last target is on its last 1,000 hit points, you'd be wiser to save the cooldown for the next one. Shotgun mode is a little more standard. It does reduce damage, but hits up to 6 targets in the cone of effect at rank 3, but note the typo in the description that suggests it can hit up to 9 targets. Whoops. The other thing is that, strictly speaking, this is a biomolecular torpedo with crit chance, crit severity and accuracy boosts, and its special firing mode. By my reckoning, 4 mods takes a weapon up to ultra rare grade rather than very rare grade, but that's nitpicking, and regardless, I think I have a new favourite torpedo. Sorry, Omega. The counter-command deflector, however, oh, this could be a tricky one. The basic stats are very nice, as I said in my last video: extra accuracy, damage and durability, plus some particle generator skill and a bit of knockback resistance. The 2 set gives you 5% extra defense chance and some anti-proton resist. The 3 set gets you a 3 km AoE that does minor damage, a bit of snaring, but crucially will pop any fluidic puddles that happen to be in range. The 4 set, finally, gives about 10k worth of emergency shielding, and a significant knockback and a few scorch marks on the hull of any hostiles nearby when they fail. So why am I hesitating to go for this? Because the assimilated set offers better durability and also boosts power to shields, weapons and engines. My first impression of the counter-command set is that it's intended both to specifically counter the Undine, which is hardly a surprise, and it also tilts its balance slightly towards damage over survivability. If you want a naval analogue, then this could be considered battle cruiser gear, rather than a dreadnought or line cruiser's equipment. It emphasises damage over survivability, so I expect this set will shine on an Avenger or a MOG, but I wouldn't necessarily use it on a Gal-X or a Galaxy or an Odyssey. That said, we still don't know what the numbers on the engines, warp core and shields are officially going to be. I might yet be very, very wrong about this, but I'll hopefully find out about the impulse engines in a few hours when I hit Tier 3. Until then, or at least until the next holodeck happenings, farewell!